All right. In three, two, one. Listeners, welcome to the podcast, or welcome back to the podcast. We have my friend Sachit Gupta joining us today from Hawaii. Sachit, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. How
Thank
are
you.
you?
Great, great. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And it's worth a mention. You escaped Corona in Austin, Texas, to go to Hawaii for 6 months, which I think is really smart. Which part of Hawaii are you in?
We're in Maui. So yeah, it ended up happening where I was thinking about like with COVID, like it's going to be a long-term thing. What do I want to do? And then a friend of mine was basically putting together this house with 7 people. And he's like, do you want to come spend 6 months in Maui? And could not turn that down.
How do you say no, man? So I actually have a good friend who is in my podcast mastermind, and he's kind of a podcast mentor to me who lives in Maui. So once you get out of quarantine, and if you want to connect with people, he's a really successful entrepreneur and podcaster. I'm happy to connect you guys.
That would be amazing. Who is it?
His name's James Jacobson. Have you ever heard of him?
I don't think so.
He's
No.
been in radio and media for 30 years or so. Really successful entrepreneur and yeah, just a smart guy. So we have a podcast mastermind together and we bounce ideas off each other quite often. And mostly when James says, do this, Chris, and I do it, it turns out to be a really great idea. And I should probably listen to him more often, actually. No, but I'm glad to have you on the show. We met probably 6 months. We met 7 months ago, right before COVID hit. So for those of you, it's October 2020 right now, and so you can put a timeline to our story. And we started just talking podcasting, and I was impressed with the things that you have been doing. I think you just launched your new podcast, and you got on the top 10 business podcasts really within the first 30 days or something, right?
Top, yeah, it was for about a few days. It was number two in business and number 25 across like all shows in the US.
Oh
And
yeah.
that was completely unexpected, but very, very rewarding.
Has it stayed there, or and this is a bit different than normal times because of coronavirus, but have you seen a decline on its rankings, or was it just, do you think the initial push got it up there in the organic algorithms of Apple, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so it definitely didn't stay there. I'll share what we did and
Mm-hmm.
also what looking back I would have done. So my background before this is primarily in using paid media to grow audiences. So when we launched our show, I've spent like 5 years trying to figure out like what to do for iTunes specifically. And
Mm-hmm.
finally, last year, I found someone who kind of like cracked the code. And so when we pushed it up the rankings, it was a combination of paid media and being a guest on other shows. And it didn't stay there because honestly, I was sort of unprepared for what happened. I remember I was getting dinner with some friends and we just literally started the growth stuff that we were doing that day, and my growth person texted me at like I think it's like 10:30 at night. He's like, "Yeah, you're number 4 or 5 in business. What do you want to do?" And I think at that point we'd reached like top 100 in all podcasts. I'm like, wait, what? And he's
Uh-huh.
like, "Yeah," and I'm like, "Okay, like keep pushing." And so he kept pushing and got it up to as high as number 25 in business.
Uh-huh.
Um, and definitely like I think it's like it's the story with paid media, right? Like if you keep spending, you can keep something at the rankings, but if you don't keep spending, it doesn't stay there.
Yeah.
So we obviously didn't want to keep spending. I think what I would have done differently is one, I didn't actually have like a lot of other shows recorded and a consistent publishing schedule afterwards.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've realized about all these platforms is they reward consistency. So if you're publishing at the same time every week, that's what they want. What
Yeah.
I was doing was we put out 4 episodes and then didn't have any recording and then didn't publish for like a couple of months and then published again. And it just like the listeners didn't stay.
Yeah.
So like having a more consistent schedule. The other thing, and again, like because it was me and a few like one growth person, we didn't implement like 80% of our ideas. The other thing I would do is I would have already have like PR contacts ready to go. So
Uh-huh.
basically launch a podcast, get it up the rankings, then get PR stories about how like a new show launched and became like a top show right away. Kind of like the Ryan Holiday playbook.
Right.
Um, because that takes that sort of like thing that happened creates a story, creates the perception, and makes that a reality.
Yes, exactly. So I want to talk more about the strategies and the things you used and the details about that. But I'm going to build up the suspense so we can talk about that towards the end of the show and talk more about podcasting and where you both you and I see it going over the next decade. But you have a really cool, now Medium article. You were going to speak at South by Southwest in 2020 and tell your story and kind of open up about it, but that got canceled. And I was reading through the Medium story, and it's a great story. Actually, I saw myself in a lot of the hurdles I had to go through, in your story as well. But let's talk about your life story. So started out in India a few decades ago. I won't say how many.
Mm-hmm.
And then where did it go from there, Sachit?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in India, moved to the US in 2006. I was 17, just sort of in pursuit of the American dream, and had grown up like really like with one of my uncles before I was born. He moved from India to the US and then came here, started a business and all of those things. So like really like grew up hearing his story. I remember showing a friend recently, and I didn't realize it was a weird thing until like I told him I was looking at SAT books probably in like 5th or 6th grade because my brother was taking the test to come to the US, right? Like it was just like always this thing that we were going to do. So I moved to the US, and then it starts in like probably in 2007 where I got my first internship in Silicon Valley at this company called Water Cooler.
Did you move straight from India to Silicon Valley?
Yeah, so we moved from India to California because that's where my brother was going for college and we had family.
Got it.
But then I ended up going to college to Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, and partly it was because I moved with my mom and dad, and I was like, I want to go to college in the US to be away from everyone. And if you're 30 minutes away, because I was deciding between a college in California and Pittsburgh, ended up picking Pittsburgh because I was like, I want to be away from everything, and like otherwise, like, what's the point, right?
Yeah.
So I came back for the summer and got this internship in marketing. I was like, I don't know marketing. So I looked up all of these marketing blogs, and I found Seth Godin's blog, father of marketing for a lot of us. And like, I just started reading, and like really like reading his blog is how I learned marketing.
Okay.
And then went back to college. And then like 2009, I was interning at Bank of America. I still remember at some point I went to this bookstore and found the 4-Hour Workweek. And that book has been a revelation and been sort of like the start of so many entrepreneurs. I was like, this is amazing. First time like someone like who like thinks like me. Yes. And I remember like at that point actually like realizing like how much of an impact both Seth's work and Tim's work, and then like later in college I was listening to Mixergy, all of that had on me. And I was like, one day I just hope I can like go like say thank you to these people like who've had this like impact on me.
So you had this dream. You had this dream to say thank you to Seth Godin, Tim Ferriss, and Andrew Warner, just to show your gratitude. Okay, gotcha.
Exactly. Yeah. So after college, ended up working at GE, and very quickly knew that like this wasn't my life. Like I was not going to be in corporate America. Right. I did this test where I looked at this person who was sitting across the cubicle from me, and I was like, 20 years, do I want to have that life? And like nothing against him, right? It just like I knew like that's not what I wanted. So after a year, I was like, I'm gonna quit. And so I quit my job. I remember still like calling my parents. I was like, look, I can go travel, or I can get a job right away.
Right.
And I was like, I'm going to do the smart thing. So I booked a one-way ticket to Bangkok, and they were not very happy about that. So I went to travel, and then from there, like ended up moving back to San Francisco, and I was like, I'm going to start a business. And so I started basically emailing all of these companies being like, hey, like, my skill is marketing. And like looking back, I'm like, I didn't know that much about marketing back then. My skill is marketing, like just for consulting. And I sent hundreds of emails. And one of the emails was actually to Andrew Warner, who runs Mixergy. And he was like, okay, like this sounds interesting. Like, let's talk.
But before we go there, can we back up a little bit? Because I know a bit about your story while you were traveling, and then before you were starting the business or trying to start the business, you had some really tough times, right? So I think you ended up in a hospital in Bangkok or somewhere in Asia. And
I think I feel like this is like almost like a rite of passage that anyone who does like the nomad thing goes through.
Right.
I was in Bali, and it's funny. I first spent a month in Bangkok while traveling, and I still remember I had travel insurance, and I was like, I haven't used it. I don't need to renew it. Screw it. From Bangkok, I went to Bali, and like I think like one day we were traveling from Kuta to Ubud, and I was going to take this bus, and then I ran into someone I had met in Bangkok, and he's like, "I'm driving on a motorbike, like just come with me." I'm like, "Okay." So I was just like sitting on the back, and like we went to Bali, and like yeah, like we're almost there, and he's making this turn, the bike flips, I fall down, and I'm like, I get up, I'm like, I'm okay, and I try and like move my hand, and I couldn't move
Oh
it, like
no. Yeah.
this hand. I'm like, oh, I've dislocated my shoulder. So yeah, like I ended up dislocating my shoulder, and then they took me to this clinic, then took me to this hospital. It was kind of crazy. It was like, what you would expect? Like we went to the hospital, and they're like, yeah, like the doctor who fixes this lives 2 hours away, so we have to call him. And so I'm just like literally sitting in the hospital like this with my like hand like holding my shoulder, and then by the time it was like I think like 1 a.m. when we left the hospital, and I still remember we still hadn't booked a hotel, so they had to like find the hotel to like crash at, and I'm delirious with like anesthesia and stuff. It was a crazy experience, but I've also learned it's so almost like this like rite of passage for travelers who go to like Bangkok and Bali.
Yeah, so I've been in a hospital in Chiang Mai for food poisoning, and then also in Peru, also for not food poisoning but salmonella. And so yes, it is a rite of passage for people that travel long term for sure. But this was kind of also like a dark moment in your life. Like you were asking yourself all these questions: Is my path going the right? Is my life path going in the right direction? Right? Like this was.
Yeah,
This
yeah. I
hard.
mean, I quit my job to be like I'm going to pursue this travel thing, and then this like accident happens, right?
Yeah.
And then I recover and go back to India for a bit. Then I moved to San Francisco, and for 4 months I'm just like sending all of these emails, like getting nothing back. And I remember like being like, oh, it's been a year since I've quit my job.
So
I've
emails to start the business, right? To start your new
Yeah,
business.
emails to start the business and clients. Yeah, exactly. Like,
Okay.
and I just distinctly remember I would send all of these emails, and I got really good at sending cold emails. So I would get meetings with all these co-founders or founders of companies. They'd be like, "Oh yeah, you sound like a good kid. Like I'm sure something will work out, right?" And I'm like, "But you're not hiring me." And like I'm like, "Is there something wrong? Like, am I doing something wrong? Is there something wrong with me?" Right? Like you
Right.
start asking yourself these questions, and yeah, for a long time, like nothing worked. So that was probably like one of the low points.
Okay. And
Yeah,
you
and so
you were going in a cafe every day, same cafe, right?
oh
And
yeah, the
sending these emails. What was the name of the cafe?
So there's this cafe in San Francisco called the Higher Grounds Cafe, and it was like near where I lived. And I remember I would go there every week, and I would get this banana Nutella crepe because it was delicious. It's still delicious.
Uh-huh.
And like I would go with my Kindle. I was like, okay, like I'm sending all these emails, nothing's working, but like this is one thing that's under my control is like just keep learning. There's a Ty Lopez joke in there with like knowledge and stuff
Uh-huh.
in his ad. But yeah, I was just like sitting there and like learning, and that became sort of my refuge because I was like, I go there, I feel good, and like yeah, it was something I would do almost like every week.
And your the so you spent 4 months sending emails, not getting much traction at all. What was your? It was just a cult. Like you were just looking for the company's email, trying to get in contact with the decision maker, or the CEO, or the founder, right, to see if you could start this business, this media business. And so what was the first hit you got after 4 months and probably few thousand emails? Like who was the first person you got traction with?
Yeah, so I sent a lot of emails. At some point, I was like, I'll even take a job because I was like running through the savings that I'd saved from like 1 year working at GE. One was I did a thing with this company where I applied for a job, and they were like, we'll do a test with you, and then if you like the test that you do, we'll hire you. So I did the test, and they're like, this is great, and I actually did not get hired. And I was like, what? You like the test? And I actually remember it was interesting. I showed a few months later, I've through a friend I met, went for lunch with Heaton Shah, who's the founder of like Kissmetrics, very well known in marketing. And he looked at it and like, I remember like the meeting wasn't going well. I'm like, hey, like I did this test for a company. Can I show you? And I showed him, he's like, wait, you just did this as a test. How long did it take you? I'm like 1 night. He's like, this is really good. You should start blogging. And actually I remember I started blogging, but then I posted something on Hacker News. And it just got destroyed. Like literally, like people like this is like they're like why is this person even posting this? And I stopped blogging because I was like this isn't working. So I went back to like switching like cold emails, and I realized like I'm curious now like how much of like that not working publicly ended up making me always being behind the scenes because like that's what I did for like the last like 8 years.
Okay.
But we'll get to that. So yeah, like I started sending all these cold emails, and one of them is Andrew Warner, and he's like, this is really good. Like let's get on a call. So I got on a call with him and I sent him these ideas, and he's like,
So
"This
to
is really good."
monetize his podcast or to increase the stats of his podcast, or what were the
Yeah,
ideas?
it was a combination of like getting more listenership. Like I remember one of the ideas was, oh, Mixergy should be in every colleges. So can we reach out to colleges and do a partnership with like the entrepreneur institutions to like give some courses or interviews for free and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember all of them, but yeah, like along those lines of like increasing listenership. And he was like, yeah, like these are really great, but my company isn't ready to hire you. And I was like, this is the politest rejection ever. And so like for a long time, I think like I moved to San Francisco in January, and like nothing worked until November of that year. So Andrew then moved to San Francisco from Washington, DC. And he was working out of this office called Regis. And I had a sort of like a membership to their lounge through like travel hacking and stuff. And I was like, I'm just going to start like working from there, because if I'm near him, he'll like, maybe like he'll want to like work together. And like, I was like working, right? Cause I was literally just sitting and like sending cold emails. Right. I didn't have any clients. And then one day he comes out of his office and he's like, I'm building this thing for a gifting thing for Mixergy. Do you want to help? Uh-huh. And I was like, yes. And I remember like I went to his office, we worked for 2 years, and he's like, what's your rate? And I was like, no, this one's for free, whatever. He's like, no, like tell me your rate. I was like, and I remember like my voice was just like shaking. I was like, $100 an hour. He's like, cool. So he basically like right there, like sent me a PayPal for $200. Uh-huh. And beyond that, like thing that I did with the company, and I actually did a small project with someone else before. That was like the real first hit where I was like, okay, like someone hired me, like one of these people that I listened to. So this could work out.
So from all the other emails though, there was no traction whatsoever.
No traction. Like I got all these meetings, and yeah, like nothing happened. And I look back at that now, I'm like, why didn't I be like, what? I didn't like take time to reflect and see like what was working. Mm-hmm. And what I realize now is it's actually very simple. I was really good at marketing, which is getting attention and getting the meeting. Yeah. I was not good at selling, which is like in the meeting, like asking for the sale. Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. Did not realize that back in that time though.
Now you know, after a really hard lesson.
Yeah.
But then, so this is a strategy I think they talk about in, what's the book? Think and Grow Rich, right? Where they say, okay, if you can't work for the person that you want to work for, go and volunteer your time or give some free work to them, or find where they're at and rub shoulders with them, exchange ideas, right? And you applied this, I think it's a Dale Carnegie strategy or something like that. Yeah. And so you applied this, and, and now you've got, your first $200 that Andrew paid you. And so what happened next?
So what happened next is actually interesting. So I worked with Andrew, and I remember I was interviewing with this company, almost getting a job. And so a few months before Andrew hiring me, I'd gone to interview at this other company. And while I was at this like conference thing, I had my second shoulder dislocation. Oh, no. So I was like, so my arm was like back in a sling, right?
What'd you do that time? Was it from the same injury, or did you ride another?
Yeah, same place, but I was just like literally like lying on grass, and like I twisted my arm and boom, popped out.
Oh man.
So I started doing this with Andrew, and like it's like now I moved to San Francisco in Jan 2012. Mm-hmm. It's December 2012, and I'm like, okay, like New Year's starting, I'm gonna like it's gonna be better. And first week of 2013, I'm out with friends in San Francisco, and this was crazy. Like I haven't shared how this happened publicly before, but I was literally like out partying, and we're dancing, and I like put my hand like this, and it pops out again. Dislocation number 3. And I'm like, this is a great start to the year. And I also, at that point, because I had already gotten a dislocation, I couldn't get insurance because this is before Obamacare and all. So I'm just like now like medical bills are coming up, but like all this and like, what is happening? So I remember calling my doctor, and he's like, you're probably going to need surgery. I was like, there's no way I'm getting surgery in the US because it's so expensive. So I actually ended up flying to India, getting surgery, recovering that, and like moving back to the US.
Okay.
So that's what I did. And I came back to the US, and basically it was like now like April 2013. So it's been 2 years, almost 2 years since I've quit my job. And that's where like that story that you read starts. It's like, I'm 25, like health, which is like 3 shoulder dislocations, clients and work. Like I don't have any clients. I've made like $200 or something, a little more with a few people. Like nothing has worked. And I'm like, this is rock bottom, like what's going to happen. Cause I had to also like move back home at that point.
Yeah. Okay. And so you're back in the U.S. with dislocation number 3 after surgery, post surgery.
After surgery.
Yeah. And so then we're going into, so you haven't officially started your partnership with Andrew yet, right?
Yeah, we've done a small project, like, but nothing
Right.
long term.
Okay. So what was
And so
next
do you want to
then?
hear do you want to hear the details or the thing that we did that started everything?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So at some point, Andrew, like I'm back in the US, like he emails me. He was doing these like Scotch nights, and he was like, "Yeah, like, do you want to come like meet other entrepreneurs?" And I was like, "Sure." Like I went to that, and then the next day he emailed me. He's like, "Hey, I'm doing this project where I'm basically sending these bead bracelets to people.
Yes.
I want like more of them made. I don't have time to deal with it. Can you hire me for? Can I hire you for a day to do this?" I was like, "Sure." And I remember like being like, "Oh yeah, like I'm." Just like got a degree from like Carnegie Mellon, and I'm making these bead bracelets, right? But like, it's like I think it's a great example of like everyone, you have to like start at the bottom, right?
Right.
And what's crazy was so he'd send other bead bracelets to people,
Mm-hmm.
and I was like, "Can you send me the invoice for that so I can make the same one?" He's like, "I don't have time to deal with it. Just get it done." And I was like, "Okay." So I did what I did, and I went back to like give it to them, and I was like, "These are the same ones that you got." He's like, "How are you so sure?" Because I didn't give you any details.
Mm-hmm.
And so I shared with him what I did. What I ended up was doing was, and this is like, again, like crazy connections. I basically Googled Andrew Warner bead bracelets in Google just like to see like if I can find like how he got them. And somehow he had used this thing called TaskRabbit,
Okay.
which is like a place where you can like place tasks. I found like the Google result for the task he created.
Okay.
And so I ended up looking up. I'm like, okay, like this is the one he like made bead bracelets, and the name and number of the person who did the task was there.
Oh,
Or maybe
wow.
the name was there and like Google the name and like found the person. I remember like calling them. I'm like, this is really strange, but this person hired you to make these bracelets. Can you tell me where you got the beads and bracelets? She's like, yes, this is very strange. And okay, like it was this shop in San Francisco.
Okay.
So I went to the shop and like I bought the same beads and like the strings and like made them myself, right?
Yeah.
And I think what I realized now is like when I told Andrew that story, he's like, you think differently. And now even like looking back, I'm like, what was I doing? Like, how did my mind like come up with this idea of like finding that person? But he was like, this is really good. Like, can I hire you for a week for like random projects? And then it was like 2 months, and like that led to like us working together for like 8 years on like a lot of different stuff.
And is this 2013?
It started, 2013. Yep.
So what were the stats? Like, how old was his podcast at that time? Do you remember?
I don't remember the download numbers. I think he started in 2009 or 10. So
Okay.
at that point, it was definitely an established podcast. He'd had like the founders of Wikipedia, Airbnb, and Dropbox. And I actually remember in Silicon Valley, it was a thing to be on Mixergy. Because a lot of like, for a lot of companies, it was almost like this rite of passage where I started my company. I've made enough revenue that like Andrew's invited me on to be on Mixergy.
Right. Absolutely.
I remember one instance where like a lot of the like meetings I had, like I mentioned, like hadn't worked, right? And so I started working with Andrew, and one day I was just like hanging out with him, and we took the train in San Francisco to the BART. So we were coming out of the train, going up these like escalators, and it's like me and Andrew. And then we ran into one of the people I had like had a meeting with that didn't work out. And he saw me, he said hi, and he goes, wait, are you Andrew Warner? Looking at Andrew, he's like, yeah. And he like says hi. He's like, oh, how do you guys know each other? He's like, Andrew's like, we're working together. And I just felt this like glee. I'm like, yeah, like it didn't work out with you, but now I'm working with Andrew, who you know.
Yeah. Awesome, man. You didn't follow up with that guy, and you were like, hey.
No, at that point, it was just like, I started working with Andrew, and like with Andrew, it was really interesting too, because it was like basically my role, and we didn't even have a title like until 4 months in, was just like special projects. So whatever he wanted to get done, I would do. And I remember like, I did all these things that like, looking back, it's kind of like crazy, but not to me. Like I would, for example, like monitor his like Twitter feed and replies and all of these stuff, because I wanted to know what was going on in his world. Because I was like, any problem that he's facing, I want to be able to anticipate it before him and solve it, because then he's going to give me bigger challenges. So I did like a lot of different stuff with like helping like systemize the company, audience growth, building like tech stuff for like one of his courses. So we did all these things. And at one point I remember like I'd emailed him about something related to sponsorship, and he sent me a reply, and I was like, I can tell like something about the way he responded. He doesn't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
And so I was like, because I'd proven myself, like he trusted me, right? I was like, it sounds like you don't want to deal with sponsorship. I think I can do it better. Will you let me take a shot? Don't pay me anything up front, but give me a percentage of like whatever revenue that comes in.
Nice.
He's like, sure. So that's where I like end up becoming this like guy like who now is known for podcast sponsorships. That's how it started. So basically, I looked at how he was doing it. I did a few calls with companies or friends of his who were like doing well with sponsorships, like Jordan Harbinger, Pat Flynn, and basically like because I was coming from outside, came up with my own framework of like how ads should be sold. And then he had a list of companies that had already been interested. So I started reaching out. I'm like, hey, like you applied to like sponsor Mixergy. Let's go on a call and figure this out. And the thing that I changed was usually sponsorship on podcast is based on CPMs, right? It's like 1,000 downloads, $25 CPM. And so that's how you calculate the price. I was like, that doesn't make sense because like 1,000 downloads on Andrew's podcast versus some other podcast is very different.
Right.
Because of the quality of the audience.
1,000%.
So I got on a call with the sponsor and I was like, and I didn't actually even know like CPM was like that big of a deal. So I was like, let's not even talk about that. What are you guys looking for? And they're like, we're looking for like 6 customers or like these many customers. And I'm like, how much are you willing to pay for a customer? So they told me the price. And I was like, okay, so let's say like we can get you like 5 customers in a month. Does that make sense? They're like, yeah. I'm like, okay, 5 times what you're willing to pay. That's a sponsorship. Do you want to sponsor for a whole month? They're like, makes sense. Yeah, let's do it. And in that conversation, what I ended up doing was doubling the prices. Because now looking back, like I sold based on value instead of CPM.
Yes.
So that became the first sponsor. And I call Andrew. I'm like, yeah, like I sold the first sponsorship at this price. He's like, what? Because like basically like double the prices, right? And he's like, okay, this sounds great. Like you keep running this. I was like, cool. So I started doing that. And then I remember a year later, we did this with one sponsor and another sponsor. Then like both sponsors then wanted to sponsor. And I was like, oh, because Andrew only had one sponsor at the time. So I ended up calling Andrew. I'm like, Andrew, how about we have 2 sponsors? And first he actually said no. And I was like, what do I do? Because both these sponsors are interested. So who do I pick? Then I was like, I went back to Andrew a few weeks later. I'm like, Andrew, I listened to Tim Ferriss's podcast and Jordan's. They have 2 or 3 sponsors. And both these sponsors want to sponsor. Do you want to do it? And he's like, okay, let's test it out. So we said both yes to both. And like, I remember like basically like during that week, because we said yes to both, we closed 70,000 in sponsorships.
Nice.
And
$70,000 in sponsorships in 1 week.
Yeah. Yeah. And the year before, Andrew had done like 50. So he's ecstatic. He's like, this is amazing. And so that's sort of like how I like took over sponsorship and became known as the person who does podcast sponsorships.
That's incredible, man. So I've got so many questions around that. So you, this is one thing that comes up a lot is like still podcast advertisements are based on CPM, right? So cost per 1,000. But the podcast statistics aren't reliable. Downloads doesn't mean listens. Listens don't actually mean listen to the entire podcast or skip over the advertisement and this sort of thing. So you have podcasts like Joe Rogan's who have 15 minutes of advertisements before they even start the podcast. And, 95% of the people just skip over those and go straight to the meat and potatoes. But you thought, and this is 9 years ago or whenever, you thought, okay,
5 years ago.
5 years ago. Okay.
Yeah.
So you thought like, how can we, where's the value that we can give these people? And if we give them that value, we can 2x the price for normal sponsorships. Very much like thinking out of the box and very ingenious. Okay. So I'm curious, like, how has sponsorships changed? We'll go back to your story here in a second, but how has sponsorships changed? Have they? I don't feel like they've changed that much in the past 5 years. What are your thoughts on that?
I think so too. So one of the things I've been managing sponsorship for Mixergy, or did, starting then until like earlier this year, and we were able to replicate this with like multiple sponsors. Another thing I would do, I'll share this and then I'll go back to your question. I remember watching the show $1 Million Listing, and basically like in $1 Million Listing, Frederick Eklund, who's like the broker in New York, was doing a launch for a building.
Okay.
And he basically, what he did was like, he created like this whole thing around the launch and was like, yeah, there's only like 100 apartments and like, you got to like buy now. And then he would like call like the people interested, like, oh, it's already being sold out. I'm like, why don't I do this for sponsorships? So what I started doing after we had like a few sponsors that we got was like, let me actually back up. All of this is predicated on getting results for sponsors. Like if you don't get results for sponsors, none of this works because they don't want to come back.
Right.
Like Mixergy had an audience that made it easy because people would actually like buy sponsors products. So like sponsors want to keep coming back. So what I started doing was basically in September of the year, I would send an email to all sponsors. Hey, I'm having conversations with all sponsors for next year. And my aspiration or like what we think will happen is like, I forget what the exact word I used, maybe predict or something, that like we'll sell out Q1 in like 3 weeks. So I basically have like conversations with like all sponsors. And the first time we did it, I think we sold out half the next year before the year started.
Nice.
So like most podcasters don't know what sponsor they have the next week.
Right. Absolutely.
We'd start the year with like between like, I mean, I think like at our peak of doing that, there was a year where before in the first week of January, we'd sold out 80 or 90% of the inventory for the whole year.
Wow. Nice.
By just like making that switch. Right. And I think part of it was also because I had direct relationships with the companies and the sponsors, not operating through agencies. So now coming back to your question, what I realized afterwards was talking to other podcasters, most sponsorship right now is happening through agencies.
Yeah.
And the thing is like agencies in a way like are playing this role of the middleman between the podcaster and the brand. So the brand and the podcaster don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
Right. In this way, in this one, like we're like directly talking and like really like I was looking at more as a marketer, like how do I create a campaign that gets the brands the results? Because if I can do that, then you can play with all of these different things.
Yeah.
And because people aren't looking at sponsorship that way, it's like, oh, brand's paying me money. The first question I always ask a brand is, okay, let's say you spend $10,000. What's the result that you want?
Yeah.
Right. And they're like, oh, we just want customers. I'm like, how many customers? They're like, we don't know. I'm like, what's your like customer acquisition cost? Like, how much are you willing to spend? And like most brands don't know the answer. So I'm like, okay, if you spend 10,000, you get one customer. Is that good? And they're like, no, we want more. I'm like, okay, like how many? Because we need to measure this.
Yeah.
And I realized from talking to brands, like most podcasters or creators aren't asking the question. So if you don't know what success looks like for the brand, how are you going to deliver and then get them to come back again?
Exactly. And so I still think like this is something that is really broken in the industry because there's no great way to measure statistics and an ROI for a lot of those sponsors, because a lot of people don't need, they either don't know what they need, just like you said, or they don't have a way to track what they need, or they're just, have extra disposable income and they're like, hey, maybe it'll be great for brand awareness sort of thing. So yeah, it's really interesting. What do you think can change? What do you think podcasters can do to get more advertisers for themselves?
So I think there's a few things even before like getting advertisers, because it's like, I actually think now like it's easy to get an advertiser. It's hard to keep them.
Yeah.
So a few things. One is like, I think, so have you heard a podcast where like you'll hear the host reading an ad?
Yeah.
And like, he has not tried the product. He or she has not tried the product. Like, they do not care about the product. They're reading a PDF, right?
Right.
So the first thing is like really like only having advertisers that you actually care about. So I did this math with someone. It was really interesting. I'm like, let's say like, okay, like there's 52 weeks in a year, right? Let's say you publish 2 episodes a week. So that's 104 episodes. Let's say the average amount of like episodes of sponsors is 8.
Okay.
Right. So 104 over 8, that's like 14 or 15, right? You only need 14 or 15 advertisers to like have a successful year.
Okay.
And when I share that, like a lot of podcasters are like, oh, I didn't think of it that way, because I think there's an imbalance in the relationship right now where like podcasters put sponsors on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And they'll take anything they'll get. They'll take any price they get, any sponsor they get. But really it should be like this, or like this, like ideally, right? Because it's like, you have a valuable audience, you're bringing value, and like you actually can pick the advertiser that you want.
Yeah.
So, and then the question is like, how do I pick which advertisers to get? The easiest thing is like, if you have an audience, go to your audience and be like, what are products that you're already using? Right. So like if you have, let's say like your audience is tech entrepreneurs, you're like, what products are you already using? They're probably using an email marketing CRM. They're using a accounting software. they're using, like what are other tools that you use?
Myself or
In
the
your
audience?
business, yeah, in
Yeah,
your business.
so same thing. Like you've got software for podcasts, you've got software to manage your money, you've got software to um, what else? You know, email marketing, CRMs. Yeah, yeah,
Right. Exactly. Right. So like it's like so from there you can like get an idea of like what are tools that people are actually using.
yeah,
And if someone in your audience is already paying for something, it's more likely that if you bring in a sponsor like that, they'll pay for that.
yeah.
So that's like the first sort of like mental switch you have to make. The second is looking for sponsors that are high value. Like they have a high LTV, so they're willing to pay more for a customer. So for example, like let's say you charge 10,000 for a sponsorship. Um, if a sponsor is willing to pay $100 per customer, that means they need what? I'm blanking on the math. 100 customers, right? Versus if they're willing to pay 1,000 customers, they only need 10 customers.
Yeah.
So for example, like recruiting companies, they'll pay like a lot for a customer, so that means they need less customers. So going for sponsors that have a very high LTV for their potential customers.
Yeah.
That's another thing. Like that was a big shift for us when we started doing that. Suddenly, it became much easier to deliver an ROI
Yeah.
than like having something that like is like a pen where like they need like 1,000 sales of a podcast. It's like, and a lot of times when I talk to companies, I ask them these questions. I'm like, look, I know like given like what you need, we actually cannot deliver an ROI for you, so I don't think you should sponsor. They're like, wait, what? Like no podcaster has ever told us that. Like, don't sponsor my podcast.
Right. Exactly. That's incredible, man. Okay, so let's go back to your story. So you're working with Andrew. You've worked with Andrew for a couple years now, and you've monetized. You doubled, you tripled his income for the business for his monetization. Something I definitely want to talk about later is new and creative strategies for people to monetize their podcast, because 99% of the podcasters out there suck at it. But so what happened after? So you got a year of or almost a year of sponsors laid out for Andrew. What happened next?
Yeah. So at that point, I was still like I was consulting, so I had like clients building websites, clients doing marketing. Like I was doing all these different things. And I remember I was at a mastermind with a friend, and everyone there was like, okay, we need to pick a niche. And like I'd done really well for Andrew, and I was like, okay, like my niche is going to be podcasters. So I was like, okay, I'm going to pick podcasting, and my goal is within like 3 years work with like the top podcasters in the world, which was like Tim Ferriss and all of those, right? And so I picked that, and I remember like at that point I'd recorded a testimonial with Andrew because of the sponsorship thing that we did. So I just gotten those like videos back, and I was like, oh, like I can use this. So I came back to San Francisco, and I just started emailing friends. I was like, yeah, like I'm focusing on podcasters. Do you know anyone? And a friend of mine, Ned, he replied, he's like, oh, like, do you want to work with Tim Ferriss? I'm like, yes, like that's my goal in like 3 years. Like, of course. And I'm like, can you make an intro? He's like, and I remember he came back with, he's like, I don't know what the angle is, but if you can give me an angle, I can maybe like send him something. And so I showed him the testimonial that Andrew had done, or that I'd done with Andrew. He's like, okay, this looks good. Actually can send it. Like, send me an email and I'll make the intro. And I remember thinking, I'm like, this is so, or like, it feels like I'm not ready. So I, for a month, I actually like hesitated on sending it to Ned because I was like, I don't think I'm ready and I don't want to fuck up this opportunity.
Yeah.
But something else had connected, and I'll share that story really quick, is a lot of the stuff that I'm doing with free work, kind of like you mentioned, like Dale Carnegie's book. For me, I learned it from this book, Recession Proof Graduate by Charlie Hohen, who basically used these strategies to work with like Ramit Sethi, Tim Ferriss, and like Tucker Max and all these people. And so I read that book back in college, and I would just like always like keep telling Charlie about like what I'm doing. Cause I was like, oh yeah, like I used your book to like work with Andrew, then I did this, then I did this. And like, he was like, okay, like you're actually like using what I'm saying. And what ended up happening was Tim had gone back to him and been like, I want to hire someone like you. Who do you recommend? So almost a month after I sent that email to Ned, where I was like still hesitating on that intro, I wake up and there's an email in my inbox. It's inquiry from Tim Ferriss. I was like, what is going on? Because like Charlie had told him, and it was basically like, yeah, like Tim was looking for someone to hire, and they were like, are you interested? I was like, yes. So and I was like, yes, I'm interested. And like, I basically replied, and then ended up getting on a call with Tim the next day. We talked for like 20 minutes, and we're like, let's meet in person. And I remember just being like terrified. I was like, I can't fuck this up. So I spoke with Tim, and he was like, all this sounds good. Like, let's meet in person. And I was like, cool. And he's like, my assistant will send you an invite. So his assistant sends an invite. And I still get goosebumps thinking about this now. his assistant sends an invite. I open the invite and I look at like the location they picked. Right. So remember the coffee shop we were talking about before?
Yeah.
Where I went during like my darkest times.
You were sending all the
His
emails
team,
out. Yeah.
yeah. His team had picked that same coffee shop.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, what are the chances of that connecting? And I just knew like at that point I knew like this was going to work out. So I went there, met him, and then met him again a week later, met with his team, and basically was like, one thing I could help you with is like audience growth through Facebook. Cause I'd also like, while I was doing sponsorship stuff, done consulting with like brands around like running their campaigns. We did a test, it worked. And basically that led to working with Tim and his team to manage their paid media to like for audience growth for like the next 3 years.
Right.
Yeah. And the crazy thing in that is like, from when I was like, this is like the darkest moment and rock bottom in 2013 to then working with Tim, which led to like working with Seth like 6 months later, basically within 3 years of like rock bottom to 2016, all those 3 people that I mentioned, Tim, Seth, and Andrew, I was working with all of them.
All of them. Yeah. So, okay. So I'm really curious to ask you this. And a lot of times it could be just chance, right? But why do you think those 3 people, like, they stood out in your life, right? And they were huge, they were very impactful, and they were kind of heroes to you. Why do you think that all came to full circle? Like, a lot of people say, oh, it was intention, it was just chance, it was just, who knows, whatever, the universe or whatever. Why did it work out for you? Just curious. Why do you think it worked out for you like that?
I honestly don't know. I think a lot of people will say like, luck isn't involved. I don't believe that. I think there is luck. The way I think about luck is different though. Like, I think a lot of people say like, oh, like I could get lucky, and then they just like sit at home and are like waiting for luck to happen, right? Like that. It's not like that. Like, a friend of mine has this concept, which is luck surface area, which is basically you do things that increase the chances for luck to happen. Okay. So I think like part of it was like, I think a big part of it is like, I just didn't give up. I kept sending those emails, kept like at it, right? Because a lot of people would have given up. And like a friend of mine, I remember like asking me, they're like, why didn't you give up? I'm like, honestly, it was just delusion, because I was in it for so long that like, I didn't want to be like, oh, I failed and I gave up. So I'm like, I'm just going to keep trying and like something will happen. I think it's that. I think it's, I don't know. I think it maybe is a combination of like intention.
Right.
But I think the one thing that it comes down to is just like not giving up and like going at it, but also don't want people to listen to that here and sort of like take it in a prescriptive way of like never give up, because sometimes like when you're doing something, it is better to give up, retreat, and like take a different path.
Yeah, for sure. But it's good that you didn't do that this time.
Yeah. On this side, then, yeah.
So then you worked with Tim for, what'd you say, 3 years?
3 years, yeah.
3 years, focusing on growth and monetizing the podcast. Is that what you're?
Not the sponsor. Like, his team was handling that.
Okay, gotcha. And then Seth Godin came along. How did that connection happen?
So that was similar. Where and actually the subtext in a lot of this is like it all comes down to relationships. Back in going sort of like back to like college, Seth had launched, or actually this is a year after college while I was working at GE. Seth had launched this thing called the Alt MBA back then. Yeah. And basically like he'd like hired 6 people to do like work with him for 6 months on this thing called the Domino Project. Okay. I remember when he like came out with the list, one of the guys was this guy, Willie Jackson, who basically before that, I think he'd worked at Deloitte or one of the like consulting firms. And I was like, I'm working at GE, he's worked at Deloitte, like similar kind of like path. I just sent him a cold email. And I think that's maybe another thing is like, I'm not afraid to like cold email anyone.
Yeah.
Like, if I want to like read someone, I'll just send the email and like, maybe they don't reply. That's fine. So I called him and I'm like, hey, like I'm at GE, like you did this, like, how did you do this? So I was like random, but like, would you get on a call? And he actually got on a call with me and like, same, like I just kept him updated after, like kept emailing him after being like, this is what I'm doing. Oh, now I quit my job. Now I'm working with Andrew. Now I'm working with Tim. Like, so like, and I think this is another thing is if you can show someone your trajectory and like that you're like actually growing, then they become invested in helping you. Right.
Yeah.
So with Billy, I was like showing like I'm growing, and then like Seth launched the Alt MBA, like the actual big program, and Billy was a CTO, and I remember just seeing a Facebook ad that his team was running, Seth's team, and I was like, I think I can do this better, and I'm also now running ads for Tim, so like that gives me sort of like a social proof. So I just emailed Billy, I was like, hey, like this is what I'm doing with Tim. I saw your ad. I think I can like help you guys. No hard sell. Like if you guys want to have a conversation, let me know. So I got on a call with the program director, and I actually remember that she was like, we don't want to hire someone for this, but we want to learn. So can we pay you for consulting to teach us? And like one of the things I always try and do is I try and get to the point where I can like demonstrate my skill set as fast as possible without any like sort of like legal or contracts or whatever, right? Because like if someone can see the work I'm doing, then it's more likely they'll want to like work with me or hire me. I was like, yeah, like happy to help you. Like, and they're like, how much would you charge? I'm like, don't worry about that. Like, let's do 2 hours for free. And so, cause I was like, I want to help you as fast as possible to show you what I can do.
Yeah.
So she's like, okay. So we did like 2 calls and I showed them like everything about Facebook. And at the end, they're like, this is complicated. Can we actually like hire you to run the ads?
Yeah.
And so like, that's how that connected.
Nice. How long did you work with him then?
And that was almost 2 years.
Nice. Okay. So now you've got your full-fledged podcast media business up and running and doing very well for itself, working with other entrepreneurs and many people out there. So before we start talking more on podcasting, is there anything else to this story that you want to add? Because there was a lot there. I think we completely went through the hero's journey. And anything else that you felt like we missed out?
No, I think we cover. I don't think I've actually ever gone into this much detail on a podcast besides that story I wrote. So thank you for guiding and shepherding that.
Well, that's a great story because like I've been in dark places in business. Like I've been broke. I've been sending out maybe not thousands, but hundreds of emails over and over trying to get contacts, and I've been in spots like that, but it's always great to hear those stories because I think they really inspire other people to keep going. It doesn't matter like what area we are in our entrepreneurial career, whether we're starting out, whether somebody hasn't ever started a business before, or we're on business number 7 and we're looking for investors for our very first time, and we've got to send those emails out. Even Tim Ferriss has a story. Didn't he go to like 38 publishers before somebody accepted the 4-hour work week?
Something along those lines, yeah.
Yeah, and finally somebody accepted him, and he was like, "Oh God!" And then he got on the New York Times bestseller. Very similar to you, like you got on the top Apple Podcast rankings when your podcast first came out. Podcast is called Conscious Creators, by the way. Sachit's podcast for those people that want to check it out. So the podcasting world today, we were going to talk about quite a few things, but it's really interesting because it's 12-ish, 15 years old, depending on who you ask. And but it's still very much the wild, wild west. And I think a lot of us podcasters feel like that. And the challenge is the amount of work that it takes a lot of people and their inability or lack of know-how on how to monetize it to give themselves a ROI. So what's your take, Sachit, on using a podcast to monetize your own products and services versus using your podcast to do that versus trying to build a podcast for advertisers?
Yeah, totally. I think if you look at most industries, there's like the sort of like Pareto principle, like the 80-20, or like I think in podcasting is 90-10. And my view on this is like most podcasters actually cannot make like an income that's like livable just through advertising, because the reality is like most podcasts don't get that many downloads, right? I think I remember reading a statistic where if you're getting more than 2,000 downloads an episode, you're in like the top 20% or something.
Yeah, I believe it.
And if you like, again, like go back to the CPM thing, if you go by like normal CPMs, 2,000 downloads means $50 an episode. Like you can't live off that unless you're producing like multiple episodes a day. That can be changed though. Like if you get like sponsors, like we talked about, where like they'll pay way more. But again, it's like you have to have a very like niche focused podcast. And I almost look at like podcasts as like you're basically creating this thing to like build trust with your listeners, build trust with your people. And if you monetize it indirectly, you can make way more, right? Like that could be like selling products, that could be selling courses. I know a lot of like companies right now that are like software companies or whatever. What they're doing is they're basically creating podcasts as content for middle of the funnel. So like once someone is interested, you're like, hey, cool, let's listen to this podcast, because it just builds such a different kind of trust, right? I think podcasts can be a way to demonstrate a skill set. Let's say you're trying to enter a new industry. start a podcast, interview the top like 20 people or 10 people in that industry, 15-minute episodes, publish that. Suddenly, like, you know everyone,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's one thing we should actually highlight is there are people that like I would want to ask questions that if I send an email being like, hey, can I pick your brain? I would not hear back.
Right.
And instead of that, if I send an email, can I have you on my podcast? They will clear their calendar. They will give me 2 hours. They will answer any question that I have.
That's the majority of my guests.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's such a great learning tool, right? And I think like through that, you can like build the relationships that you can leverage for something else. So I think like a lot of people try and like make money from something like directly.
Yeah.
Or maybe if you go like second, third order, order and like do something there's much more that can be done.
I just thought of this while you were talking about it, but like say you have a dream job, this is for not the entrepreneurs, but you can probably apply this strategy as well. Say you have a dream job and you want to work with this company, then start a podcast as your resume, interview 10 or 15 of their major competitors, or even maybe the CEO or founder of the company that you want to work for, and then go put in your resume, say, and put that on your resume that I know more about the competition, or I know more about your competitors and your business than the majority of people that will ever apply for this job, right? And it'll take extra work, but that will absolutely make somebody stand out. Same way for maybe if you're raising capital for a business or anything, like whatever your goal is, start a little podcast that you can even just do 10 episodes and have those recordings to help you get, achieve whatever goal you want to achieve. So
yeah. One of my favorite stories is Harry Stebbings. So he runs a podcast called 20 Minute VC where I think he was 18 in his like college dorm with like $50, started a podcast and just basically started reaching out to like top investors. And I think he's published more than 1,000+ episodes and has basically interviewed like the best of the best investors in Silicon Valley, right?
Yeah.
And like think about the amount of like relationships and capital, like social capital he's built.
Yeah.
Because now you can like start connecting guests together and then start like having guests back and like sending them information. You can become the center of any world with the right guests and a podcast.
Well, that's 100%. And when I started this podcast, that's exactly what I figured out. Like I wanted to be a 6-figure entrepreneur. So I interviewed 100 6-figure entrepreneurs, and then I became a 6-figure entrepreneur. And then I interviewed 100 7-figure entrepreneurs, right? And now I'm interviewing major influencers, and then I'll have to interview 100 8-figure entrepreneurs. Maybe not 100, hopefully. That takes a long time. But then maybe I'll get to the point where I can interview 100 billionaires, And so it's just like a strategy to continue my own growth, but connect with all these amazing people and build this amazing network and end up doing business with people and make great businesses. Like you're a creator, you like that. Creators help creators create, or people create, and it makes a win-win situation all around, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's talk. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, let's chat about your strategy. So you actually launched your first podcast was it earlier this year or late 2019?
December. Yeah. So the story from kind of like picking up where we left off was, so I was working with Andrew, Tim, and Seth. And then basically like through a lot of like personal development over the last year, I realized, actually like when I was a kid, I was really good at art and like being creative. And for like different reasons, I stopped doing that. And subconsciously entered a career supporting other creators when I wanted to be the creator all along.
Right.
And when I realized that like that was like kind of like fear preventing them, like I have to face that fear. So like last October, I was like, okay, I'm going to start a podcast myself, and then basically launched it in December. And I think you were going to ask about the growth stuff.
Yeah.
So we'd like, I'd done a lot of experiments when I was working with Tim and other people trying to just like figure out like, how do you crack growth? And then I found a friend of mine who had like kind of like figured out some of the pieces. And I was like, all right, let's test this out on my own show and like add a few things. And most of it was like paid media, which is basically like finding the right people at the right time on different publishers. So now we can like show ads on Yahoo, New York Times, like we've evolved sort of like that thing. And I think he's going to probably end up creating an ad network through that. And we just like spend money on ads for the podcast. And one thing I figured out was iTunes cares more about the rate of growth of a show than actual growth.
Yeah.
So if you have 1,000 downloads and you get 1,000 more, versus if you have 10,000 and get 1,000 more, it's very different, right?
Right.
So we just like stacked growth, and like we didn't know it was going to work that well, but it did. And yeah, that's what got us up in the rankings.
What type of advertisement were you doing?
It was just like banner ad, a combination of like banner ads, and like mobile apps. So like if you
Okay.
go on New York Times and stuff, like the banner ads that you see.
Okay. Yeah.
It was just those. And now what we can actually do is do banner ads where it's like an interactive ad where you click, and then there's a podcast player embedded in the ad.
Okay. And were you guys focused on reviews or strictly just like downloads?
Strictly downloads. I did get reviews. I don't know if that made a difference. I think it's still like, I'm still like, I don't have a complete formula for it,
Right.
but I do know like it seems like downloads matter more than anything else.
How many reviews did you guys get in those first 30 days?
Right now it's at 70, and I think about 50 or 60 of them came during that time.
Okay, so not a lot. And then, but your downloads, how many did you get in the first 30 days?
I know it was over 20 or 30,000, and like in basically I think in the December and Jan, it was around like 20 to 30,000.
Did you ask any friends to promote it, or contacts or anything? Anybody?
I asked friends. I don't know like how many actually did. One thing that was helpful was one of the episodes I recorded was with James Alster, and he liked the episode so much. He's like, if you're launching, like, how can I help? And I'm like, oh, I want to get down. So he basically took the episode we recorded and published it on his feed, being like, hey, I did an interview on this show, and like, go check it out. His show is huge. So I'm sure that helped a lot too.
Yes, very cool.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll share on this though, I think it's interesting is like, and I've realized this like after the fact, even though I like hit those download numbers, I went back and studied like other creators, and like you can actually do this on YouTube because it shows the views. Mm-hmm. I think one arc of this like creator's journey is when you start, you will do a lot of experiments and stuff. Right. And like it does take time to figure out your voice. Right. Like you can't just like come out and like be the best. And in a way, I almost like hacked it, and I realized it affected me in like a negative way because I was like, then had this expectation, like 20 episodes of in being like a top podcaster. Right. But I'm like, I'm still finding my voice, right? Because you can't like 20 episodes in, you don't know what you're doing. You're still like doing what you think you're supposed to. Right. So that created its own problems in a way, because I had all these expectations and I'm like, oh, I'm not living up to them, which is why actually I didn't publish for a while. Yeah. So I was like, what is my show about? Like, it's interesting. Like there's a quote from Jim Carrey. He was talking about his dad and like how his dad wanted to be a comedian, but wasn't, then got fired from his job. Mm-hmm. And Jim Carrey's lesson from that was, if you can fail doing what you don't want to do, might as well do what you want and then fail. Right. And for me, like my corollary to that is like, when I launched my show, I was kind of like the initial episodes was what I was supposed to do. Uh-huh. Right. Because I wasn't like really doing what I wanted. And I was like, if I can succeed doing what I'm supposed to do, might as well just do like what I actually want to do, like see how much successful that can be. Right. So now that's what I'm exploring is like, and that's what we were talking about at the start of the show is like the art of like creating a podcast. I'm like way more interested in exploring that of like different styles of interviewing, studying different interviewers. Can you like do something completely different from like interviewing and like storytelling, mixing different interviews and like creating like one story from that? Like those are the things that I want to experiment with now.
I want to ask you here in a second about where you see the future of podcasting, but also before we get there, so did you, when you advertised for your podcast when it first came out, were you guys did you do any social media advertising? Facebook, Instagram, Twitter?
We did not. No.
No. Okay. Any reason why you chose like banner ads and that type of advertising versus social media?
So I remember when because like a lot of the stuff I did with Tim, it's like NDA, I can't go into details, but we did try like for podcast banner ads. The problem I found with social media is, so if you do an ad for like a Facebook ad, right? Mm-hmm. What you're basically doing is like you show an ad on Facebook, you send traffic to a landing page. The landing page has a pixel, which sends Facebook information back about like what action people took, which tells you how the ad worked. Right. So like you basically like create a feedback loop, which allows you to improve the advertising that you're doing. The problem with sending traffic to iTunes is there's no feedback. Okay. So if you spend like $1,000 on ads on Facebook and send that traffic to iTunes, you can't create a connection from iTunes back to Facebook of like what worked and what didn't. Because like I remember when we would do ads for just a tangent, we'd like do a lot of experiments. So we'd start with like, let's say like 10 Facebook audiences, 4 images, 4 text. So that's 10 times 4 times 4, which is like 160 different ads.
Yeah.
And we would see like out of those 160, maybe 20 would work. So we turn off the others and then like double down on the ones that worked. Right. So like that, we weren't able to do that for podcasts through Facebook. With this stuff that we did with banner ads, the person I worked with, he figured out some like tech way to basically, with like the phone, send feedback back into our system. So if someone clicked on a banner ad somewhere, it led to the podcast app.
Nice. Okay.
And then they went back to where the ad was. It was sending us feedback of like what people did. So we were able to improve that. And like, basically it's like high frequency trading for advertising.
Yeah.
So that's why we did that instead of like Facebook and stuff.
That makes total sense. So we've got, it's kind of a mystery where podcast is, well, mystery, not so mystery, but like an uncertain answer where podcasting is headed over the next decade. Because we have a system of podcasting that is great at getting the message out there, but it's not necessarily sustainable for a lot of people to continue to do over the long term. So what's your predictions? Like, what do you think over the next 5 or 10 years where podcasting's headed, Sachit?
Yeah. And so what I always like doing is like first like studying the past, because I think like a lot of times like history has the answers for us and like things repeat in different ways. So one thing I'm fascinated by is the entertainment world. So if you look at like let's go back to the 80s, right? 60s, 70s or 80s, we had all of these actors and making movies. And basically at that point, the sort of like gatekeepers of everything were the movie studios. Right. So there were a few movie studios like Universal, Sony, that basically like greenlit movies and stuff and like controlled funding for the creation of movies, because the production of movies was expensive. So they were the gatekeepers. Right. And then like in the 80s, there was this agency that started called Creative Artists Agency that ended up like managing the artists. So they were the agents for the artists, and they started like packaging like directors and actors and stuff. And then they would like basically put together a whole movie, go to all the studios and be like, we have this movie ready to go. Do you want to fund this? If you don't, we'll take it to all the other studios. So basically they kind of like took some of the power away from the studios towards the agency. Like there's a book called Powerhouse CAA about like how they basically in the 80s and 90s and still today like controlled Hollywood. Fascinating.
That's called Powerhouse EA. Is that what you said?
CAA. So it's Creative Artists Agency.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. And so I think like now what's happened is with the internet, with like all these like apps and stuff, production is no longer the gatekeeper, right? Because like to create a podcast, you need a $60 mic like we both have, and that's it. Like you don't need like massive things. And like the challenge now I see in podcasting, so especially with COVID, there's two things happening. The number of podcasts that are being created is going up exponentially because everyone's starting one.
Yep.
And then what that means is like the number of content that's being created is also going up exponentially, more than exponentially, because more people are creating more content. Yeah. So that's no longer the scarce thing because there's so much of it. So the scarce thing is attention. And what matters now is distribution. Because it's easy to create content. It's hard to get distribution, right? And all of these platforms like Facebook, Amazon, and then Spotify and Apple Podcasts, they're now becoming the gatekeepers because they gatekeep distribution. So almost like I always think of this as like the platforms have now become the movie studios.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're seeing that in like movies with Netflix now like producing movies and spending way more on content than like a lot of studios. And so I think like a lot of answers are already there in like what's happened in other worlds, right? Like you're seeing this with TikTok. I was reading this article about how there's all these like famous TikTokers, and like when the TikTok ban was happening, there's another app called Triller, which basically is like literally like whining and dining the top TikTok stars to start producing on Triller. Microsoft did the thing where like they got Ninja on Mixer, and now like Ninja, who's like the pro gamer, is actually being represented by CAA. So I think for the top 10% of podcasters, it's actually very similar to the movie world, where like these platforms are becoming gatekeepers. You'll see people signing like exclusive deals with the platforms, like with like Joe Rogan and Spotify. Right. Because if you look at like platforms like Spotify, what they care about is getting more listeners and increasing the listening time, because that means they can then show ads.
Yeah.
So anything they can do that, they're going to do that. So like they'll start like taking the top podcasters to those and like signing exclusives. Like DJ Khaled is launching an exclusive podcast on Amazon. Then like Apple is going to start doing this. One thing that for me was fascinating was hearing how like, so Spotify right now, what happens with them is they have deals with labels where basically if someone listens to a song on Spotify, for every listen, they have to pay the labels a royalty.
Right.
And this is one of the reasons they are getting into podcasting, because if someone listens to a podcast, they're listening to less music and they don't have to pay a royalty.
Yeah.
And then in response to that, I don't know if you've seen like music studios are now getting into podcasting. So Sony, for example, is like producing podcasts or like funding podcasts.
Yep, absolutely.
So I think it's just like it's like I think podcast is in early days, it's early innings. It's going the way of like music and movies, and yeah, there's like wide open spaces, and I think it's going to like the market is going to separate out into like top 10% and top 90%, or bottom 90%. And I think the challenge for the bottom 90% is literally like, how do I get distribution? How do I monetize? Yes. And now for those things, there's all these like software tools that are being built, because finally it's a big open, big enough market.
So how do we do that? How do we become the CAA of the 1980s? Like if we're podcasters and there's so many big gatekeepers up there, and you know, the vast majority of podcasts are in the bottom 90% compared to the top 10%. What are some ways that we can increase distribution and or monetize? Because if we really don't need to be in the top 10% if we can monetize those really well, right? We just need like a select niche, but we have to figure out a great monetization strategy for our own show and our business. But then distribution wise, it's like, what are we going to do to stand out to get in that top 10% if that is the strategy?
Yeah, so going first, like talking about distribution. I know you've had Ron Lynch on your show too already.
Yeah.
He's one of the most fascinating people I've thought about in terms of like positioning and marketing.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing, if you're creating a podcast now, is like thinking about your positioning and like your market to like really like, how do you stand out from everyone else who's creating a podcast, right? That's the start. Like that's why I like call my show Conscious Creators, because I'm trying to like change the word influencers to creators. And then like own that word. And that's why I do like a mix of like business and creative, because no one's like kind of like doing that intersection.
Okay.
So that was sort of like my positioning. The way I'm thinking about it is like, where do people who I want and listeners already hang out? So like go there, like go on other podcasts, bring listeners to your own. My goal is to start monetizing as fast as possible, whether it's through courses or different like ads and stuff. And I haven't done that yet completely, because I was just focused on creating better content. As soon as I can reach a certain level of monetization, I want to take that money that's being generated and put that into paid media to grow the audience. Okay. Like one of the things I haven't, like full disclosure, been successful at it. One thing I'm trying to do is basically go to sponsors and be like, look, my show isn't big, I know, but advertise on my show, because there's no one who knows how to turn like ad money into downloads. So if you spend $10,000 to like put ads on my show, I'll take all of that and like put it on ads to increase the downloads of the episodes you sponsored.
Yeah.
Haven't been successful yet at that, but I'm sure like I'll find one or two companies that are interested in that.
Yeah.
And basically like really like we want to create that virtuous circle, which is whatever money you're creating, put that into ads, build the audience, which means people will pay more and you'll generate more revenue. And then you put that back into growing the show. And just like, it's easy to say, but like, it's like hard to build. That's what I'm trying to do, is like build that initial flywheel of growth.
Right. So go ahead.
So that's the first part. And I think like the other part that shouldn't be discounted though is like, at some point you just need to have a really good show, right? Yeah. Because that's how like things enter the zeitgeist and become big. Right. And I think a great example of that is like the book Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. Like he's not spending money on ads, but like something about the book and the timing and everything, it struck a nerve in the market and like in consciousness where it just took off. Yeah. And like that's the end goal, is like creating a show like that.
Yes. I want to ask you about, so because we have all these gatekeepers, not all these, but a handful of gatekeepers now, because really it'll take for the average podcaster maybe 10 years to get through a lot of those gatekeepers, to produce content, to find their voice, to get really good content and find their niche, to then penetrate the gatekeepers to be in the top 10%. It's a really daunting road for a lot of people. So there's this idea of, well, why don't we create non-public type of podcast and then create a subscription model for our fans, our current listeners. So then they have special content that they pay monthly or yearly for. So a friend of both your and mine, Tan Pham, does that, and I think he does it pretty well with his productivity show and his business Asian efficiency. What's your thoughts on that? Have you played with that? Know anybody else that's using it, like besides Tan? And where do you think that's going?
So I haven't played with it, but I love that model because I think the other thing that's happening is with this sort of like platforms, like the way they are, you can actually now build a direct relationship with your audience.
Right.
Like if you're like an actor in a movie, it's like you act in the movie, then the movie goes to like movies, theaters, and the theaters sell the tickets, right? You don't have a direct relationship with your audience. Now as a podcaster, you can be like, hey, go on this link and sign up. So you can build those direct relationships, and people are starting to monetize that. Shout out to like two companies in this article that I love. One is this article called the 100 True Fans Model, which was on like Anderson Horowitz. And then the company actually tends using like Supercast, and there's another one called Glow, which are basically enabling these sort of like subscription models. Because I think like what that does is it basically brings the economics of a SaaS business with like recurring revenue and brings that to podcasting.
Right.
And the early numbers I've seen from people talking with Tan and talking with Supercast, I think it's fascinating. And they actually did a post which was Joe Rogan got ripped off because like his Andrew, who's like one of the founders of Supercast, his view is that Joe Rogan would have made way more by partnering by doing more subscription thing rather than like selling.
Right.
So I think like that's the first thing. The other thing that's happening is all of these things where it's like content, commerce, and all of these things are getting merged. So you see that with like Kylie Jenner. Kylie Jenner had an audience on social media, built a makeup brand, right?
Yeah.
And then like that blew up, right? She's a billionaire or whatever. So I think that's what you'll see is like creators partnering with now companies and actually building their own products instead of advertisers. Right. You're seeing that with what's his name? Bryce Hall, who's like a TikTok sort of like celebrity. He has his own energy drink. So instead of like partnering with an energy drink, people are starting to like start their own businesses that like they have more equity in and more long term. So I think you'll start seeing that. But again, going back to like that top 10, bottom 90, you have to sort of like get to a level of audience to be able to do those things.
Yes. Well, do you? I mean, do you though? Like, because if you start. Say you start your own website and you're offering a service on there and specific content behind the scenes, you could kind of build that up over time without having the audience beforehand and just have a subscription-based podcast and maybe throw out some feelers there and just put out an episode once a month or something like that. Like I think I could see starting out like that without having the audience beforehand. It's easier, obviously, if you have the audience beforehand.
I think it depends on the goal, right? It's like, I think you can probably get to like 5 to 10K revenue a month pretty easily with something like this. But if your goal is like build like a multi-million-dollar company, then you need an audience. So you're right. Like, it depends on like what the goal is.
Yeah. Would you ever, so I'm curious about like, so you're kind of growing as a creator through this entire process. You were the creator behind the creators for so many years, helping these guys monetize and grow their podcast. And now you've started to create kind of your own personal brand and your own personal podcast, right? So I'm curious, like how you visualize and how you want to plan out your own personal brand. Cause this is something that I'm always working with myself. So for example, like I'm really tempted to start another podcast, which is kind of in the space that I'm in, but not completely in the space that I'm in. And there's a bit of overlap, but not a complete overlap. Right. And I love that idea from, an open, flexible personal brand strategy, but I also don't love that idea because I love to focus on one thing. And it's something I talk about a lot with my clients and people that on the podcast. And
Gary
everything.
Keller.
Yes. And so what's your thoughts on that? Because you're the creator behind the creator, but you created the creator podcast, but you're also the podcasting guy. Would you ever start two podcasts, one that's not necessarily related to the things that you're doing now, or what's the vision for you over the next few years?
Yeah, I almost think of this as like, do I want to be the artist or the business person?
Right.
And honestly,
Yeah.
it is a struggle because I can go both ways and make a case for both.
Yeah.
I actually was going to start another podcast a few months ago, and I was like, it's not a smart decision because I want to like make sure like one is standing on its own.
Yeah.
The other thing we're also looking at is basically building shows around other creators. So I'm talking to a few people about like who like basically want to host a show, don't want to manage the business side at all. Okay. So if I can like build a team like that does growth and does the monetization, and then basically like start like publishing other people, and then build like a massive podcast network where instead of advertising, we're like building subscription businesses behind each podcast. And like the audiences are like in the same psychographic, so we can start merging audiences. Okay. I think Barstool Sports is a great model of that, where like they have all these different shows and personalities, and now they've built a massive business around it. So I'm exploring. I think maybe I think like that's the problem is like there's so many different options. Yeah. That the way I think about it is there's an artist side of me that wants to go with some options, and there's like the business side. Yeah. And on different days, different ones are like in charge almost. So I am still figuring out which one to pick.
Yeah, I'm in the same field. One thing that a friend mentioned, he's a podcaster as well. He said, well, what you should do, Chris, is continue to build what you mentioned, artist skills that are kind of already embedded in the business model until you're so great at those artist skills, those creator skills, that you have to merge and you have to create something else on the side. But then you'll continue to get the wheels of the current model really deepen the foundations, give it more roots, grow the audience. And then there'll be a point where it's like you can no longer hold back all these artist skills that you have, that you've got. Like for you, for example, you were the creator behind the creator for so long, helping these guys make their podcasts great. And then you're to a point where like, I've got to do this on my own now, and I've got to create my own podcast to help these creators. So maybe that's a good way to look at it over time, because it's really hard, because I'm a creator as well, obviously. And for us creators that are also very business savvy, it's hard because we're like, there's a devil on one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder. There's no angel. And they're both like, oh, this way.
Yep. Yeah. I love that. And I think this is another thing that like people, maybe it's important to highlight, is because sometimes like people will think like podcasters or like people like you look up to like have everything figured out. No one does, right? Like everyone's still experimenting. Everyone still kind of like goes through these like struggles. And I think I'm curious like what your thoughts are on this. There's also this almost like beautiful insecurity in being a creator, because there's this like Ira Glass thing, which is like, if you're trying to do anything and you have taste, your initial stuff is going to suck. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And then if you're trying to like, I mean, for me, like I've been recently studying just like the skill of interviewing and watching like people like in late night, like Johnny Carson and Graham Norton in England. And like, those guys are like fucking pioneers. And when I look at like the way they're interviewing, I'm like, I have a long way to go. Right. Yeah. So almost in that, it's like still doing it, still publishing, knowing you're not where you want to be. There's that insecurity. And like, and sometimes almost it's like, you know the business and the growth side to make that big, but then you're like, but it's not that good. And I think like that's like every creator faces that.
I agree. It's that either that desire of wanting to be better, like that consistent, it's the desire to grow, right? That's what it is. It's the desire to grow that makes us insecure, but also confident based on like the results that we've created in the past. But it's, go ahead.
Good. I was going to say the other one I haven't faced yet, because I just haven't done the creation side for so long. I look at musicians, right? Like there's stories of musicians that did a certain kind of music and got really famous. And then they want to like, then they have to make a choice. Do I keep doing the same thing for the rest of my life? Like, we know podcasts that for like 5 years have maybe been very similar. Or do I like want to completely jump genres and like do something completely different. And then your audience actually wants you to stay here, but you
Yes.
want to make that leap. And I think like that's another part of like that creator's journey that I haven't reached yet, but I'm excited about.
Yes, a perfect example is like Taylor Swift, or those musicians that start out in country music and they want to go to pop or hip hop or whatever, and their audience doesn't want them to do that, but then they do and they become even greater. But a challenge in itself, right? Like that transition, that's glass ceiling that we have to break through. So, so
Totally.
yeah. So this has been fantastic, man. This is a phenomenal show, dude. We went over an hour and a half, um, and
We did, huh?
yeah, we did. um, Before we wrap up, Sachit, is there anything else, any other tidbits you want to add? Talk about podcasting, growth, your story, anything before we close off?
Yeah, I think the message I love leaving people with, I think like I'm seeing like everyone wants to start a podcast, especially friends and stuff.
Yeah,
The thing I always tell people is like, if you want to do an interview show, like stop thinking about everything else, find 4 people to interview and just do it.
yeah,
Because once you've like gotten over that hurdle, everything else, like name of the show, blah, 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 becomes much easier. And I think that there's people like who might say stuff like, oh, there's like so many podcasts already. Like, why do we need more podcasts? I'm like, stop listening to them, because even if you create a show, do 10 interviews, 10 people listen to it, maybe like 2 of them are your like mom and dad or whatever. Just I think the journey of going through and doing it will help you learn more about yourself.
yeah,
And so I think like more people should be storytelling, because I think at our heart, right, like humans are storytellers,
yeah,
and we sat around the campfire
yeah.
telling stories to make sense of the world around us. And so I think that's what I see podcasting as, and that's why I think more people should be doing it.
Well, and it's just like, nobody says, why would you make more TV shows? There's already enough TV shows. I mean, and new TV shows and series are
Exactly,
coming out
yeah.
all the time. But they're coming out in new formats now with Netflix and long-term series and this sort of thing. So you got to be creative to stay on top of it. Like, what can you do to be different? What can you do to stand out in your podcast? So, dude, man, this has been a fantastic show. I've really enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed the chat and getting to know you better, and getting inside the mind of Sachit Gupta. If the listeners want to reach out and learn more about what you have going on, where's the best place they can do that at?
Yeah, I'm spending a lot more time in learning Twitter. So
Okay.
Twitter is just my name, SACHITGUPTA. And then my show is on creators.show.
Creators.show. Okay.
And I was surprised that no one had taken that domain name before.
and then business domain, if people want to reach out and hire you, are you still doing that, or?
Yeah, so that's just platformsmedia.com.
Perfect. Cool. Thanks so much for coming on the show, man. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for sharing all your tips and tricks and wisdom with us. Thank you so much, Sachit.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a wonderful, wide-ranging discussion.
Yes.
So thanks for shepherding that.
And listeners, thank you guys for tuning in once again, and we'll see you all on the next episode. Goodbye, everybody.